I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
That's a lot of this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
Debtors' prisons and egregious abuse by the state are a thing of the past. Or are they? On Sunday, January 7th, actress, singer, and producer Connie Britton showed up at the Golden Globes award ceremony sporting a t-shirt claiming poverty is sexist. Well, it is, just not in the way she thinks. The 1910 Uniform Desertion and Non-Support Act, proposed by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws and passed with modifications by 24 states, addressed abandonment of the family by the breadwinning parent. The unmodified version's statement on child support was, "Any parent who shall, without lawful excuse, desert or willfully neglect or refuse to provide for the support and maintenance of his or her child or children under the age of 16 years in destitute or necessitous circumstances shall be guilty of a crime. The law imposed fine or imprisonment, possibly including hard labor, in the discretion of the court." While the law appears genderless, it mainly targeted men who were at the time generally their family's primary or sole means of support, and therefore the only ones likely to be considered guilty of refusing to provide. This was due to women's lower financial responsibility at that time, when even a working mother's wages were not considered to be the supporting wage for an intact household. The child support system, in other words, is a factor of traditional gender stereotypes. The modern federal child support system started as part of the welfare program and initially only involved families receiving government aid. Since then, it has been tweaked multiple times by Congress with the stated goal of reducing single-mother households' dependence on welfare by shifting that dependence to their children's fathers. Under the current system, the custodial parent doesn't receive any child support until the amount paid by the non-custodial parent surpasses the amount the state is paying the child's custodial parent in cash assistance and food stamps for the child's benefit. This arrangement, touted as a government means of seeing that fathers rather than taxpayers provide for their children, is a farce. Nearly half of U.S. child support is owed not to the child or the child's custodial parent, but to the government, indicating that collecting from fathers is not eliminating mothers' eligibility for and collection of public assistance, and the cost of collection too often offsets any benefit of recovery. Available census data shows that on average over 80% of custodial single parents are mothers. Fathers, having to meet higher standards to obtain custody as single parents, are more likely to be financially solvent on their own and to maintain stable economic conditions through their own resources. Single custodial mothers, on the other hand, are more likely to be poor, economically unstable, eligible for assistance, and the beneficiaries of child support obligations. Even when fathers are awarded child support, it is less on average than that awarded to mothers. So, children are more often placed with the less financially solvent and stable parent, and then the state imposes a debt on the more financially responsible parent, thereby immediately reducing his financial solvency by tying up a significant chunk of his income, which the state seizes through wage garnishment and attachment of any assets he may have. Attachment of criminal liability to child support obligation intersects with gynocentric attitudes as well as custody and support law to crush non-custodial fathers. Numerous issues emerge from this one area, as explained in Elizabeth G. Patterson's report, Civil Contempt and the Indigent Child Support Obligor, The Silent Return of Debtors' Prison. In her report's introduction, Patterson states that many incarcerated child support obligors are indigent, with irregular employment, limited earning potential, no real assets, and questionable ability to pay. She attributes abuse by the system to a variety of systemic and judicial flaws and calls for restoration of equity and due process to this area. Among the flaws to which Patterson refers is the increasing tendency among family court judges to routinely impose jail time for contempt of court order when an obligor is in arrears, including in cases involving low-income obligors whose non-payment may be due to inability to pay. This is compounded by judicial abuse of civil contempt, which is often inappropriate in child support arrears situations, as the designation is for willful refusal to follow a court order, not inability. The defendant in a civil contempt case does not have the rights that are guaranteed to criminal defendants, including the presumption of innocence and the right to a jury trial. In many states, even the right to legal counsel is absent. This is a crucial issue that worsens the other contributing factors by ensuring that an obligor accused of willful non-payment will have no more ability to defend himself against that accusation than he can afford after a significant chunk of his income has been confiscated by the state. Among the systematic flaws contributing to this is the automation of the child support system. Patterson notes that judicial hearings, as the primary means of establishing and enforcing child support, have been replaced by expedited administrative proceedings and mass processing of enforcement activities, combined with automatic triggering of enforcement actions such as license revocation and reporting to credit agencies if the obligor gets behind in his payments. This, she asserts, has turned the Child Support Enforcement Agency into a super collection agency. And what are they trying to collect? Child support obligations imposed on low-income and indigent noncustodial parents are often entirely inconsistent with the obligor's ability to pay. Patterson noted 4 main areas affecting this. One was incomplete or inconsistent information. When they are able to appear at a hearing, low-income obligors' barriers to employment, such as health conditions, criminal records, or lack of education, can result in spotty job histories that make an income level hard to establish. Imputed income, a judge's estimate of what the obligor supposedly should be making, is used when a non-custodial parent cannot show up for a hearing, or a judge decides he is not earning as much as he could be, or doesn't believe his earnings disclosure is complete. This frequently results in overestimation of income in cases of low-income obligors, especially those facing the aforementioned barriers to employment. Minimum awards, which can impose debts on individuals who lack the ability to earn the income required to pay them, are another area. If the non-custodial parent is homeless and jobless, even an award which requires a monthly payment of what a full-time minimum wage worker could earn in a couple of days would put the obligor in arrears. To a person with nothing, even a small monthly payment might as well be astronomical. Retroactive awards, which calculate arrearage beginning at some point prior to the entry of the child support order, usually go back to the date of a separation or divorce, or in unwed cases, the child's birth. One example of this is the case of statutory rape victim Nick Olivas, whose 20-year-old rapist did not tell him she made him a father at 15. He found out when the state served him with papers demanding $15,000 in back child support for his then 6-year-old daughter, along with medical bills going back to her birth, plus 10% interest, then seized money from his bank account and began garnishing his wages, all without a hearing. Patterson also notes that changes in the norm for the average career have led to a disparity between the court's expectations and the obligor's earnings over time. Traditional expectations involve the obligor maintaining a long career with the same employer and consistent, stable expectation of raises and benefits increased over time. When an obligor's career does not match this pattern, but has interruptions due to the type of work he does, unemployment ending outside of his control, or layoffs due to economic instability, an obligation based on traditional expectations will impose a debt with which he cannot hope to keep up. When an obligor's ability to pay does not meet agency or court expectations, his recourse is limited if he has the means and understanding to file the correct motion, obtain legal counsel, and navigate the system. As Patterson notes in a report, limitations on the circumstances in which modification is available, judicial and administrative hostility toward downward modification, and barriers affecting access to modification procedures limit the utility of modification as a source of relief for the low-income obligor subject to excessive support award. One such barrier is state-dictated thresholds requiring a change in monthly income before changes to an order can be considered. Decreases in already low incomes may not be sufficient to meet those thresholds. Another is some states' requirement that a change be involuntary in order to allow changes to be considered, while courts may consider employment inconsistencies and even imprisonment voluntary in order to deny the obligor that consideration. Also cited is both agencies' and courts' hostility toward downward modifications of child support obligation, wherein, even when policy does not so dictate, administrators and judges exhibit disinclination to reduce child support obligation, regardless of the obligor's circumstances. If the obligor makes it past all of those barriers, federal law prohibits retroactive modification of accrued child support, so obligors like Nick Olivas would be out of luck in regards to their arrears. And here is where criminal justice outcomes enter the picture. Despite the system defining contempt in child support cases as the civil variety, on the basis that it involves non-compliance with a court order, penalties applied may include jail time. In her report, Patterson summed it up thus: a system in which child support awards are commonly set beyond the parent's ability to pay, modification procedures are neither realistically available nor likely to address inequalities, and retroactive correction is disallowed, inevitably results in the accrual by many parents of large and unpayable arrearages. Eventually, many of these parents face charges of contempt of court for their failure to pay the court-ordered support. Faithful adherence to the laws limiting contempt power would bar its application in these circumstances. A non-paying obligor is in contempt of court only if his or her non-compliance is willful, that is, the obligor had both knowledge of the order and the ability to comply. She later continues, the inability of indigent obligors to make court-ordered payments or to pay purge amounts would not be a systemic legal problem if courts were not finding such obligors in contempt and then coercively imprisoning them despite their inability to pay. And according to the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement, in 2006, over $105 billion in arrearages were owed by 11.1 million obligors. Her report showed that only 4%, in fact, qualified as even being middle class or higher. All of this combined puts impoverished child support obligors, mostly fathers, in a self-perpetuating cycle of incurrence of arrearages, penalization, reduced employability, and lack of recourse to have income changes addressed. This spirals, in far too many cases, into inevitable incarceration under civil contempt as agencies and courts hold them accountable not for the welfare of their children, but for that of the state, and for numerous factors that are beyond their control. While the state does not consider this a criminal justice outcome, it is, in effect, criminalizing poverty. It applies almost exclusively to poverty in men, who are the majority of non-custodial parents, the majority of support obligors, and who face greater debt when support is assessed. And oh, by the way, the majority of homeless, many because their income is eaten by support obligations, and the overwhelming majority of homeless who are unsheltered, because shelters prioritize women with children, then women without children, before men. So yes, Connie Britton, poverty is sexist, especially where divorced or unwed parenthood is concerned. The American legal system has made it misandric. Isn't it about time for major systemic reform?
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 20, Crime and Punishment, Revenge of the Accountability Gap. Just a quick reminder, if you want to join the chat on YouTube, please go to the Badger Live Streams channel. If YouTube is experiencing platform malfunction syndrome and won't let you listen, we're also on Twitch and Facebook. And if you want to help us become immune to the authoritative censorship of ideologue-run social networks, consider becoming a patron at feedthebadger.com. After all, a big mouth's got to be fed, right? So, I'm here tonight with the Professor of Perspicacity, Aidan Paladin, and that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, to throw open the doors of the often dark and mysterious family court system. For centuries, under English common law, ever since the creation of England's Poor Laws, government has been trying to solve the problem of the state's expenses in providing relief to the poor by going after, quote, deadbeat, end quote, family members. For the last century, that has been Western nations' approach to welfare-dependent single-mother households, labeling non-custodial fathers deadbeats and pursuing monetary remedy from them, regardless of their circumstances. It doesn't solve the problem because the problem isn't father abandonment, but single custodial motherhood as a state-funded lifestyle choice. For the last century, our society and our government has been applying the wrong solutions, in large part because they're addressing the wrong problem. But what if that were not the case? We've all heard the joke that government intelligence is an oxymoron, but folks, this is ridiculous. Even if 100% of the men hit with child support obligation and then penalized for failing to pay had failed to pay willingly, willfully, and intentionally, even if the reasons to care about the impact of this system on our men were non-existent, the way it is set up would not make sense. More often than not, the government spends a greater amount going after indigent and impoverished fathers than it collects from them. How is that saving money? And when you're trying to collect money from someone, how much sense does it make to diminish his earning capacity? Is this about recovering funds and supporting children? Or is it about keeping daddy government's foot on the necks of non-custodial fathers? What can our society do with a system that is more in need of reform itself than the people it was created to kick back into line? What do you think, guys? Have at it.
Well, yeah, it's a difficult sort of thing to take apart. I mean, obviously, like a lot of things when it comes to how feminism or sort of the increased power that we have given to women in our current system, a lot of them were put in place with the best of intentions, I think, although certainly gynocentric intentions. And you always get these stories of, oh, what about this guy who has, 18 children, and isn't that so wrong? I guess, but in terms of how it actually works out, particularly when we look at how difficult it is for fathers to get custody of their children, when, as is mentioned in the video, they tend to be much more likely to be able to provide, in part because it's harder for them to get custody. But then we do find that in the court system, it doesn't really appear to matter. Sometimes the mother can be completely ill-equipped and even inept, and yet we view there's something about motherness that is femaleness that's better at taking care of children inherently. So we end up with people who maybe don't even have an interest really in truly caring for the children, but knowing that they can game a system. Not everyone, but it's certainly it would be tempting, would it not, for some?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you can say, quote unquote, say that the system is equal in the sense that if men want to go after child support, they can, but oftentimes they are making more than the mother when they divorce, so they're not going to win child support most of the time. And even when they can get it, oftentimes they're not going to ask for it. Like, I was raised by my father. He actually got primary custody of me, and he could have asked for child support, but he just didn't want to. But there's also, it's kind of astounding the level of steps in this negative cycle. Like if you think about it, we can run down the whole thing. The father's not in their previous jobs. They're unable to pay the current level of child support. They go to jail. Then they're unable to get work and they're continuing to be unable to support the child because they're in jail or unable to get work. So you can't claim at all that it's for the benefit of the children that he continues to pay or be unable to pay child support. But it's even worse than that, because even after all that, there are very few support resources available for fathers, such as like shelters or meals, and good luck finding future work, not only with no proper clothes, no access to internet or regular phone, and a record for being unable to pay child support. So what is he supposed to do after that? Meanwhile, a mother can ask for custody, child support, and then also go on government welfare assistance, and all the while she doesn't even have to prove that she's spending a dime on the child. And we saw over the last few weeks about the kind of punishments we can expect to see even for neglectful mothers. So to call the system unbalanced is an incredible understatement.
Yeah, that's the situation, and it's been that situation for a very long time. In my intro, I mentioned the English poor laws. This goes back, I think they started, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe we're talking 14th or 15th century. And it had to do with the transition of financial responsibility for the incapable poor, the people who were disabled or people who simply, for whatever reason, could not provide for themselves, from the church to the state, and that actually happened in part because King Henry wanted a divorce, and the church didn't want to allow it. So he attacked the church, and after the dissolution of the monasteries, the church's finances were changed, and the state's responsibility was changed. Everything changed, and then the state suddenly discovered that, hey, feeding poor people is expensive. And you had, in addition to like the increase in workhouses, you had the creation of laws very similar to what the Republicans' welfare reform was like in 2000, where there was a work requirement. In fact, in the 14th century, there was such a work requirement that women were mentioned, men and women who were indigent. It could be sort of drafted into any job the state felt needed done and wasn't being done. So that basically is where it started, at least in English common law. And I don't know if this is the case in countries that are not guided by the history of English common law. But in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, anywhere that's basically touched by English common law, I think that's maybe a type of molestation. This is the way it is. And with our history in the U.S. of considering the father to be sort of the linchpin of the home, the foundation of the home, everything rides on his capability and his stability. That's been sort of a consistent thing, starting with that Uniform Desertion Act presuming abandonment and capacity to pay, and then going on with the welfare system's addition of similar laws, right on up through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then we had that welfare reform in 2000 that was supposed to solve everything and actually created a whole new class of homeless. So this is what we're dealing with. We're looking at the wrong problem. The state funds single custodial motherhood as a lifestyle choice. Women do not have to become single custodial mothers, don't have to get pregnant, don't have to finish a pregnancy, don't have to give birth, don't have to retain custody. So when all of those conditions are met, it's a choice. And yet it's the father who is held financially responsible. And then his due process rights are ignored in the process.
And it's interesting you brought up too that sort of idea of the accountability, is that it's not just the financial accountability. There's a social idea of accountability that it's not just you are owed money, but if for some reason that if you are delinquent in this payment, that you have done wrong. Socially speaking as well. So even though, again, we have given women all the ability to be in complete and utter control of this environment and situation, to be really the masters of their fate and the fate of any potential children that they may have, there's still this pressure socially and financially placed upon men that says if you not only are you wrong if you can't keep up with these payments, but you're criminally wrong and you're socially wrong. You're a failure in some way. It's unbelievable. There's really no escape.
And when it's the other way around, when it's in the rare chance the father that gets custody and the mother is expected to help support the child, it's not a problem at all. If she doesn't, it's just, well, whatever. Why doesn't she have the child? Or it's nothing like that. It's just, it's cool, whatever. Why are you expecting her to pay for it anyway? I mean, aren't you the father? Aren't you able to do that yourself?
Well, and the truth is, more often than not, at least more often than with moms, the father is able. Single custodial fathers, like they're like less than 15% of single custodial parents. But single custodial fathers are more likely to be above the poverty level than single custodial mothers. They're more likely to be financially independent and financially stable. They're more likely to own their own home. They're more likely to, unless they, the mother gets in a divorce, but they're more likely to actually have income that comes from something other than a job, like stocks or savings, or they own a business, or they have, they own something that produces money, like an oil well or something like that. And this is just simply a function of men's greater focus on financial responsibility for themselves and their families. You see, this is something that in our society, we're still at a point where the breadwinner of the family is expected to be the father. And so when women have careers, when women have jobs, they did used to, it used to be that the mom didn't even have any responsibility to the family for that money from the state's perspective. Now in poor families, everybody's income went to support the family because they didn't have a choice. But, unless you wanted to starve. But a man couldn't, he didn't have any recourse against his wife if she earned a lot more money than he did and didn't support him. He was expected to go support himself. Whereas a woman had recourse if a man earned more money and refused to support her. And that's translated even in today, where in two-income households, it's the mad money in the house. If there is mad money in the house, often comes from the woman's income. The father supports the family, and the woman pays for her own wishes and maybe the family's vacation and their that kind of wishes. And it's not necessarily a supporting income, except for in single mom households. And in that case, more often than not, they're getting government assistance and child support. So when you have a situation where men are geared towards having to be breadwinners all the time, they're less likely to not be in a position to be the breadwinner when they're in a position to have custody of their children. And in those cases, more often than not, you have to prove that the mother is dangerous to the children in order for the father to even get custody. Aside from the few states that have passed, actually, I think only one state has passed equally shared parenting. I think it's been defeated everywhere else. But aside from that situation, you have a dad that he knows he's going to have to support the family, so he just does it. And yeah, the mom ends up not paying child support, and even if the father can't support, as a single parent, can't support the family, it's still considered to be on him by the state rather than on the absent mother.
Yeah, like I know when I was very young, when my mother first left, I know my father was often taking me to his job at the radio station that he worked at to sleep on the couch because he couldn't afford to hire a babysitter at the same time as he had to go to work. And like I said, he could have gone after child support for my mother, but he just didn't. And I mean, I'm not 100% sure why he didn't. Maybe it's just because, I don't know, he felt like he had his own standard to live up to, or maybe he thought that he wouldn't be able to get it, that it would be a waste of time. But either way, he did what he had to, and there was probably very little support available if he didn't put in all that work.
Thinking about it, there's a lot of conflict in divorce that is caused by disagreement over child support. That might have been part of the reason.
Yeah, it's possible.
It's also, again, the social expectations that men have to be accountable and they have to stand up and do what's right for the family, and they don't have the option of sitting back and saying, "Okay, I'll seek out other methods of getting by. I'll try to go after my partner for child support, or I'll seek money from the state," because that's viewed as weak. That's viewed as not being accountable, and it's bizarre that we have given women so much ability to be in utter control over this situation, and yet at the same time hold them to no responsibility simultaneously. You have all the responsibility and none.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I guess I shouldn't knock my mom too much, because she could have taken the house if she wanted to. I have no doubt that she could have fought my father on just about anything that she wanted. But when she left on her own. She left the house to my father and me. And then she went off and did what she wanted to. She got her own apartment. She did her own thing. So, I mean, it could have been worse, but still, she wasn't considered to be a deadbeat mom for running off on my father and choosing to do whatever else that she was doing. But if it had been the other way around, there's no doubt that my father would have been shamed for it.
No doubt, absolutely. Even to the point of, again, if he'd had a lack of ability, he still would have been shamed for it. It would have been, well, why aren't you working? Why don't you have a job? Go get a job. And that actually, not just the government, but the people around your family will have that attitude. And that attitude's been there. It's been that way through every type of economic situation, from when there's plenty to when there's a depression. If the father is not in the household and he's not supporting the household, he's seen as a deadbeat regardless. I've even seen disabled men treated as deadbeats under those circumstances.
Yeah. It's disgusting, and there's not a lot of support for guys in those situations. Like, I deal with people calling and looking for financial supports all the time, and whenever I see somebody struggling to attain it, guess who it usually is? It's usually men, of course.
Yep, and then the other aspect of this, of course, is when a guy is in the opposite situation and he goes after child support, he gets treated as the abuser, instead of the parent in need. And this is something that I saw, the 7 Years in Hell case. I talk about this all the time, this case all the time. It's one of my big inspirations for becoming a men's rights activist, was this situation that I saw happen. And I've seen actually other guys in my life go through very similar, some even worse ordeals. That was just the one I was best able to document. When custody transferred from the wife, the ex-wife, to the ex-husband in that case, it transferred because the ex-wife married an abusive guy. And he was like, she was abusive and he was abusive. They were abusive to the people around them, they were abusive to their kids, and they were abusive to each other. And the guy beat the daughter of the divorced couple black and blue. And that was basically the basis for the custody transference. Now, when she had custody, he was paying child support regularly. They had 50-50 shared parenting. They were both working. They were both in minimum wage jobs, but he still owed child support. And then he was paying on his pay schedule instead of the child support system schedule, so he was paying early every week, and instead of paying every month, once a month on a particular date. And so he was in a situation where he was technically ahead of the game, and he lost his job due to an on-the-job injury. And when he lost his job, he immediately started taking measures to prevent himself from getting behind in the child support, but he discovered that his next payment was going to be on time instead of early. Calls the Child Support Enforcement Agency, explains to the caseworker, it's still going to be on time, but I know you're used to receiving it early. So this is what's going on, and the money is still coming. This is when you'll have it, and it won't be late. It just won't be as early as it usually is. She threatened him with jail. And, for being on time instead of early, she threatened him with jail. And 3 days difference was all it was going to be. And the mother wasn't going to get it any later because the Child Support Enforcement Agency sends out on a schedule. They don't send it like you pay it in and they send it right over. No, they send it out on a schedule. So, and I've seen them when a divorce occurs and their collection starts and they start paying out, that they've held the first 2 months before they started paying out. So for 2 months after the divorce, the father is paying the Child Support Enforcement Agency and giving the mother money. But in any case, when custody transferred, the ex-wife got $8,000 in arrears. Now, to put this into context, the National Organization for Women lobbied the federal government to make $5,000 the limit for felony arrears. You're in arrears, and it's a felony crime, according to the wishes of the National Organization for Women. They wanted it to be a felony crime for you to get $5,000 in arrears. She was at $8,000. The federal limit is $10,000, so it's a felony if you get $10,000 behind. Which, if your child support's really high, is not that hard. Being unemployed for a year, you easily hit that $10,000 mark, and you don't even have to have exorbitant child support rate. If you're in the upper income levels and your child support is much higher, it can only take a few weeks or a few months of unemployment to get that far behind. So she gets that far behind, and it took her more than a year to get that far behind. And they wouldn't go after her at first. CSEA wouldn't go after her. And when they did go after her, she had excuse after excuse. She wasn't held in contempt. And the Artemis House here in Dayton actually helped her argue in court that the attempt to collect child support from her for her child was an act of abuse by her ex-husband, that he was using the child support system as a tool of abuse against her, and that she shouldn't owe child support because he was basically using it as an attack on her. And she got away with that. That's the double standard. If it had been him, he'd have been in jail without a hearing, because it's considered a civil contempt and not a criminal contempt. That should be remedied.
She was trying to put him in jail.
Yeah, and
that kind of sounds like the snake biting her own tail, considering he wouldn't have been able to pay much more in jail. But whatever.
Exactly.
Right. What a strange. That it's so bizarre to me. Like the fact that why would you want to imprison men over this? Because you're certainly not going to get anything more that way. It's just to punish them, I think, for over nothing, really. It seems so incredibly illogical and backwards for me, other than just to say, in some way you have failed in this absurd level of duty that we have placed upon you, an unreasonable standard, and you weren't able to meet it, so we're going to punish you in a different way beyond just pretty much removing all your ability to have any say over what happens to your children and having to pay me for me making all of those decisions.
There is no logic in this place.
No logic at all. I mean, if the system was actually about ensuring that the children had everything they need, first of all, the state would never keep the child support. Because if the state keeps the child support, it's really counterproductive. But every time a mother is on welfare, the state keeps the child support. It's a very rare thing for the mother to be on welfare and the father to be paying enough that she gets money over and above what welfare is paying her. If she's that poor, usually he's also that poor. It's usually they come from a poor household and either divorced using the no-fault divorce system or never got married in the first place. But the other thing is, if oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. But if she's that poor and he's that poor and the child support is that little, it doesn't do anything to refill the state coffers. So it wouldn't, it really, like I said, is before counterproductive to, they're spending more money to collect in the first place than they're getting back. It's really counterproductive to do all of that and then not provide for the child. Welfare is not exactly a lucrative system for the recipients. I mean, it can be if you play the system. If you're one of those welfare moms, those welfare queens that knows every benefit that's available and times your kids properly to get all of them and everything. But the average welfare recipient, just from looking in Job and Family Services, you find people who are doing without things, doing without dental care, doing without decent transportation to and from work, wearing crappy clothes, old falling apart stuff, and it's not exactly something to aspire to. It's something to aspire to get out of. But all that keeping the child support does to the welfare mom is ensure that the welfare mom isn't going to get out. She's going to be stuck in that system. And then this is all counterproductive. I mean, you look at it, what do they do to dads when they can't pay their child support? They take his driver's license. Well, that's just great. Now how's he going to get to work? They report him to the credit reporting agencies. Well, that's just great. If he's applying for the job that it's going to take to pay the child support that he owes based on the imputed income the judge gave him, well, now he's going to have a harder time getting that job because he's got a bad credit report. Everything that they do there is counterproductive.
Yeah, it's very clearly more about punishing men than it is about helping the children, because there are so many things that could be done differently if it was about helping the children. But for some reason, we stick to this archaic method of doing things, even though it is proven to be harmful in a lot of different ways. I just don't understand it.
Well, because if you did it any other way, it would force women to be responsible for their own actions and behavior. And it's overwhelmingly evident that we can't, with all of the talks of inclusivity and feminism, we just cannot actually require women to be held to the same standards as men. And that's why it's about punishing men and not about children, and not about actually making men and women equal in this system in any way whatsoever.
Well, we've talked about this the last couple of weeks. I mean, they're just women. They can't be expected to be held to standards. I mean, the poor dears.
Right. How insulting, by the way. I don't know how some people tolerate themselves.
This is something that I've wondered about this for a long time. I mean, how can women who are supposed beneficiaries of this behavior, these attitudes, like, how can they not see it as the insult that it is? Because it's essentially another aspect of the women are children myth, essentially. Like, we're viewed by society as being somewhere in between teenagers and adults, rather than being seen as adults the way men are seen as adults. There's a level of accepted adulthood in women that isn't adulthood. And this goes back to, I've mentioned this a lot of times too. There was in Reddit's the Red Pill subreddit, the Hated the Red Pill subreddit. There was a post that it used to get pointed out to me a lot by feminists on Reddit as an evidence, a piece of evidence of the Red Pill's misogynistic attitudes. And
Gotcha.
They really went through and explained themselves in it, why they viewed women as stopping maturity at the age of 14.
The
after a
teenager
guy
in the house or whatever.
Yeah, basically. And it made sense. What was said in the subreddit made sense. Men from the age of 14 on are basically expected, boys at 14 years old are expected to have the degree of accountability that 14, or that adult women have. And adult women's accountability doesn't increase after that. Adult men's accountability continues to be increased as they age. A 50-year-old man is expected to have a greater degree of accountability than a 20-year-old man, because the 50-year-old man is expected to apply his life experience in a functional way to his decision-making process. Women aren't even expected to do that. In fact, it's labeled misogyny and victim blaming if anyone states that expectation after a woman has been hurt. So how can we be expected to grow up the way men are expected to grow up? All of their lives you keep growing up. And with women, it's not insulting to say that by not making that application and not being accountable for one's own safety and one's impact, the impact of one's behavior on the people around the individual, it's childlike to not have that degree of accountability. So when I read that, I wasn't personally insulted, and I didn't think it was misogynistic. I thought it was the identification of a problem that impacts men negatively in a huge variety of ways, and it also holds women back. And it's insulting that that standard is accepted, and that women would be more expected to be insulted at the outing of that standard rather than wanting to end it.
Yeah, well, one thing that you can really notice is, you said women aren't expected to be held to the same standard as men. You can kind of see that in the sort of complaints that they have about their problems in life these days. Like rather than talking about real concerns, they're talking about things like, oh, the air conditioner is turned up too high, or you're spreading your legs too far, or I don't want to have to do all these chores without having to ask you for help, even though you've said I can just ask for help. I don't want to have to do that. These are just the most minuscule little problems. And to even think about going back like 200 years to have our ancestors hear these people complaining about these minuscule little problems, like I think they would be rolling in their graves.
Yeah, they definitely would.
If we had held women to the same kind of standard as men, like even if we kind of took into account, okay, sure, sometimes a woman might raise children at home, might forego several years of experience in her career to raise children at home, and then in the case that her husband to leave her and then she's left without something to do, maybe if we really wanted to help that situation, we could have like temporary funding to help her get an education, to get into a career or something. I don't know. Anything would be better than the system that we have currently, because at least then it would be focusing on like the woman's agency and ability to actually do something in society, not just to be like, oh yeah, you're just a woman, it's okay.
This is something that I was thinking about earlier. What would a functional response instead of a dysfunctional response to the situation of single custodial motherhood in a low-income situation look like? And that's something that, they created a program, and it never really went anywhere. I mean, it's at one point my husband tried it, and it was really kind of worthless. But it was supposed to help dads who were in arrears get jobs. And when we had to move, my husband's ex-wife took the kids and moved just far enough outside of the 75-mile limit in the divorce settlement that she could turn around and say, well, now you can't see the kids anymore. And so to avoid being in that situation, we moved closer. And she wasn't really expecting that. And in doing so, we put ourselves in a bad situation because we were expecting to, come to the city and get jobs, and the Bush recession hit, and then it was exacerbated under Obama instead of relieved, and finding jobs was not exactly as easy as expected. And then the massage therapy classes turned out to be less of a boon than expected as well, because, most places want to hire cute little women, not a big strong guy who actually, like, the best massage therapist I've ever been to is my husband. He's the only one that's actually given me not just days, but sometimes weeks of relief from chronic pain. And, he's very effective, but he is a big, strong guy, not a cute little woman. And, so that makes a big difference in him getting that job. And so he tried this system that was supposed to find jobs for dads that owed child support and were having trouble remaining employed. And he went in every week like he was supposed to. Sometimes he went in every day, and he did everything that they told him to do, and he called all the time. Never found him a job. He signed up with a temp agency, and he found the job that he has now. And that was like, he's been working there now for like 10 years, maybe more than 10 years. And it was like that was totally ineffective. And I wondered about that. I thought, perhaps if men who were using that system were given the same benefit in terms of job hunting that people using aid-dependent children, and it's TANF, and it's basically if you get welfare cash assistance or if you get food stamps. I don't think if you get Medicaid you qualify. It has to be something along those lines. If you get utility assistance, employers that hire you get a tax credit. If we gave a tax credit to employers that hired men through that system, or if they could basically point out that they hired a man who owed child support, and now they're providing this man a means to pay his child support, that they could get that same type of tax credit, I'll bet it would be easier for dads to find jobs. But that would benefit men and not women, and so they don't do it. Almost all of those types of tax benefits are intended to benefit women and minorities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea, though, and it's bizarre that well, it's not bizarre. It's unfortunate that we don't have anything like that in place, considering just how many men have to pay child support and have to pay considerably over what they make. I've mentioned it before too. I mean, when my parents split up, my dad was a senior manager in a government agency and made top 1% of the state. Now it's West Virginia, but still, so not that impressive. But when I first went to see him after my parents split, he couldn't afford a gallon of milk. I mean, that's the kind of budget that he was on at that time. And if that's how it was for him, a lot of these guys and predominantly these men who come from these systems where they're not making a lot of money, they're making minimum wage, it puts everyone in that system into essentially an inescapable cycle. You're never going to get out of it. No one in it is going to get out of it. And knowing what we know about demographics, it probably means that the children aren't going to get out of it either, or they're less likely to get out of a cycle of poverty.
Now, this might be one of the factors that is the cause behind that statistic. Children raised on welfare are 50% more likely to raise their children on welfare, to become single parents and raise their children on welfare as well. I'm going to really quick go through and read some super chats, and then we can continue with the discussion. But where they're starting to pile up here. So we have, well, we'll start with this one because I saw this one first. Self-healing stem bolt gave us I believe that's €2, and said, "Hey, Prim, hey, two neck." I've
had that song stuck in my head all stream. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Then we have Syria de Flora. Gave us $2 US and says, "Thanks, guys, for everything you do." And I would say you're very much welcome. I think we're all glad to be here. Xeranx gave us $5 and said, "That's why MGTOW is viewed the way it is. A man isn't serving women or society. Gynocentrism is considered less than." And that is exactly right. The MGTOW is a huge threat to this system. And if you look at this system, part of the reason behind it might be self-serving for the people who work within the system. They get paid to make sure, essentially, that there's always going to be deadbeat single custodial moms. There's always going to be dads trapped in the child support system that they can call deadbeats for not being able to pay. And there's always going to be a need for them to be there to collect. And politicians have the same sort of cycle. They need there to be problems to solve. They don't need the problems to actually get solved. They just need there to be problems to solve so that they can campaign based on their proposed solutions to those problems. And if they misname the problem just slightly so that it sounds like that probably is the problem, and they continually propose solutions to just slightly the wrong problem, it looks like they're doing something, but there's always a job for them to do. So yeah, if men aren't getting women pregnant and owing child support, or men aren't financing households and working 2 or 3 jobs to support their families, these guys are screwed.
Why do you think it engenders so much rage? Because there's no, if it's just MGTOWs just saying I'm not associating with the system, I'm choosing to remove myself from it. That's such a harmless statement. The only reason it would engender such anger and animosity, as far as I can understand, is because on some level they know that it means a removal of the cushy system they've invented for themselves.
Yeah, and it does. This is basically the replacement for the spoil system. They just grow government instead of firing and rehiring and all that every time there's a new group. So they have this big burgeoning tentacle monster of a government that has to be continually funded and justified, and this is how they do it. So that's, MGTOW are a terrible threat to that, because they're not paying into that system. They're not part of that system. The system cannot depend on them, and they don't depend on it. And so this is one of the reasons why I say they're a practical thing. It's not crazy. Everybody keeps talking about MGTOW like it's a crazy response. It's not. It's more like a PTSD response. And PTSD is not insanity. It's a rational response to an irrational situation.
I think whenever I see people talking about quote unquote crazy MGTOWs, it's usually about the ones who are saying like all women are evil and blah blah blah. Even like for example, even in the live chat, for example, while we're talking, they're like, all women are cunts and stuff like that. That's that sort of thing. I think like actual like MGTOWs who are going their own way and not wanting to be a part of this system, I think that is a pretty damn rational thing to do in the face of a lot of what's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. And even people who do have that kind of fuck women sort of response, even them, I can't really blame you. I mean, if you look at this absolute pants on head horrible system, gynocentric system that we live in, I really can't fault you for having a very emotional response. Now, that's probably not healthy. Now, it's completely rational as far as I understand. But even the rage is not without reason,
I know exactly what you're getting at. Like, I can totally empathize. Like, I don't necessarily think it's the most rational thing, but I mean, we don't always have to be rational. It's kind of an irrational situation that we find ourselves in, that men find themselves in right now. So, I mean, a little rage is kind of justified. But whenever I see people talk about crazy MGTOWs, that's just what I see them referring to. That's all.
Right, and it's like, like you guys are saying, it's still it's an emotional response, but it's still a response to something that is, it's maybe a response to something that isn't the way they see it, but it is definitely a response to something real. And so that's not. I can't even really call that so much misogynistic as maybe a lack of understanding of the situation. And it's not necessarily malicious or malevolent so much as it is, something that I think a lot of the younger ones are going to, over time, develop a little more nuance to their thought on the situation and everything. And I've seen guys who, they get hit with men's issues all at once. They see something happen to some of their friends, like happened to my friend in the 7 years in hell case. They see what the court system is doing. They see, situations like this that we're discussing here, where the child support system isn't even punitive towards men for valid and compelling reasons, or in a sensible, functional way. It's just beating a dead horse or a sick horse and demanding that it get up and carry the state. And it's really ridiculous. And the response to something like that, you don't necessarily expect somebody to be like, oh, well, this could happen to me because I'm a guy, but I'm not going to hate the people involved, because what reason do they have to not respond with animosity to that?
Yeah, like, I mean,
So
on the odd time, I kind of almost feel like guilty. Like, are we causing people to despair by talking about these things? But then I wake up and I realize, it's better to have people be aware of these issues so that we can actually work together and challenge them.
exactly.
Even though I know that for now it might cause some people to feel quite distraught.
And there is very good reason to discuss these things, because we really can't stop this type of cycle. We can't end the cycle of the problem being misidentified and solutions to the misidentified version of the problem, the straw man, basically, of the problem, being wrongly applied to the detriment of the people involved. We can't solve that cycle until we analyze the problems and come up with better ideas. Like if we're going to have the government involved, and personally, I think the government should get out of the child support system. I
think the government should get out of everything.
Yeah, I don't think we need the government determining that. I think in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, both parents give a shit about their kids. And I think in the vast majority of cases, if they had to work with each other, they would. And I don't think women would be as careless if they knew they didn't have the safety net of using the state to essentially commit strong-arm robbery against their baby daddies or their ex-husbands or their boyfriends, or force marriage with the threat of, if you don't marry me, you're going to be stuck paying child support. You do one or the other. I think if women didn't have that that weapon, if they didn't have, which Mike really effectively, really wisely referred to as the bazooka. If they didn't have the bazooka, they would be more careful with their birth control, and they would be more consistent in deciding whether or not to retain custody after a pregnancy. I don't think there would even be as much abortion if women didn't have that perceived safety net of the bazooka, because they'd be less likely to get pregnant in the first place. They wouldn't be screwing around either.
We've actually seen that abortion rates have in no way decreased since birth control has become absolutely ubiquitous. I mean, you can get birth control is so easy to get now. I mean, I'm not even talking about barrier methods. If you have an mistake, you can go get Plan B at any pharmacy in the country, pretty much. I don't know if that's in every state, but as far as I know, in most states, you can get Plan B. We have made it.
I don't think you even need a prescription.
Easy. No, at least not in. The only state that I ever had to use it was in Maryland, and that was at least fine there. So, but it was made it so easy for women that it has put them into such a complete power and authority role that they never have to. And then they can fire the bazooka. It is absolutely bizarre that the whole idea that if we make birth control very accessible, which I'm completely fine with, and we make abortion extremely accessible, which I'm a little bit less okay with, personally, that's a personal opinion, then this would somehow fix some of these issues, but it hasn't. It's actually exacerbated some of them at worst, and at the most mild, done absolutely nothing to mitigate or ameliorate these problems. Because you would think, I think the whole point was that if birth control was more accessible, then abortion would decrease. It hasn't. And in fact, it's the number of, particularly minority populations in the United States. I mean, the abortion rates are absolutely unbelievable. It's something like 1 in 3 Black children are aborted or something. I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but it's
one statistic I do know is that per capita, Black women abort at 5 times the rate that white women do, which to me sounds like an unknowing self-genocide. I think there's been evidence that Black neighborhoods were targeted for promotion of abortion,
Yes.
That it's not necessarily a thing where you can say this was definitely a prejudice-based conspiracy, but I
Well,
think
you can if you go back to Marty Sanger.
yeah, I think that believing people haven't got the capacity to get themselves up to a higher tier of income by working their way up. I think that believing that people need this terrible solution because they just can't avail themselves, they don't have what it takes to avail themselves of more practical and effective solutions. That is a type of prejudice. It's not an intentional prejudice. It's not an I hate you because of your skin color prejudice, but it's still a prejudice. And it's actually, to me, it's a worse prejudice because it disguises itself under the cover of self-perceived benevolence, when in fact there is nothing benevolent about it. And what it has led to is, in my opinion, what it has led to is an absolute atrocity.
Yeah, I would say what's happened to Black people in this country has been essentially a genocide, or at least a. Yeah, I think you could make that definition, and it's the same
like
thing.
when our parents were growing up.
Agency.
When our parents were growing up, there were more stable Black households in the United States than there are now.
Oh yeah, in 1960, the Black family looked fairly similar to the white family, but lower income.
Yeah, and I think that would have, over time, with people realizing that prejudice is flat out stupid, over time that would have, that the poverty end of it would have changed. And I think things would have been dramatically different if we hadn't had these self-aggrandizing nitwits at the state level treating Black people like they couldn't do the same thing everybody else does, and trying to create an exploitable victim class out of them. That was a horrible thing to do to them, and it's one of the few things. Well, it's not really few things, but this is really rage-inducing. When you think about it too much, it's like you want to scrap the entire system, because obviously it's run by idiots. To do that to a whole group of people, to a whole ethnic background of people, and think, well, this is no problem, But in any case, that really plays back into the accountability issue. The destruction of that progress that had been made by Blacks was achieved using this system, this take the dad out of the household, apply the welfare benefits, and then keep him poor by tapping him for child support that the state keeps. And it hit Black families pretty hard. It hit them first before it hit white families in the same numbers, and it really did destroy the strength and backbone of the Black population in the United States in a way that it's going to take a long time to get that back, even with systemic reform. And even, especially, maybe not just even, but especially today, I will bet if you look at the ranks of men who are being wrongly imprisoned due to inability to pay high child support obligations that are a result of things like imputed income, you will see that they're probably mostly Black. They're probably a larger number, or at least a larger per capita percentage of Black men being hit by this than any other group, because they were targeted first.
Well, exactly. And when we talk about, who is hit by this the hardest, far, per capita, far more African Americans tend to be on welfare, and then you tend to have far more Black fathers who are unfairly targeted by the system. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to call it a genocide, or if you just something that is targeted towards that community, I think you could make a very good argument for that too.
And it's one that, like I said, the more I look into it and the more I think about the implications of it, regarding the people that put it into place and everything, it's sickening. It makes you angry. And you end up. This is one of the reasons why I can even if I can't empathize, I can at least sympathize with even the bitterest end of MGTOW. That this type of thing was created, and that it's hard not to see people who short-sightedly exploit a system like this as somehow malicious or malevolent. And if I didn't know individuals who have, depended on the system for a short time and worked their way out of it, and who have struggled to avoid doing that, it would be very difficult to not see it that way. But because I have, and I do, I do know people in that situation, then I can see both sides of it. But I can totally understand why, from the perspective of the person most likely to be hit by it, and who hasn't got the recourse of using that system, it would simply look like women were children, and malicious ones at that. And I think it takes a generation or two. It took 2 or 3 generations to put the women who are doing this into that degree of ignorance and that mentality towards the men and the children in their lives. It's probably going to take that long, maybe more, to totally eradicate that attitude and that behavior. But it could be done. And I think we could get to a situation where women were as much of a partner in society to men as pioneer women were to pioneer men, as women in pre-industrial ages were to men in pre-industrial ages. It could be done, but it would have to take a lot of work on the part of women who are aware of the situation and willing to push other women to do better. And
what's the incentive other than recognizing, and as I think we all do, which is that this is a major ethical issue in society. But unfortunately, when you're the person who is getting massive benefits out of a system that is completely designed to cater exclusively toward you, it takes some moral fortitude to look at that and say, no, that's wrong, even though I am the one gaining everything out of this. Maybe moral fortitude isn't even the right thing. It just takes balls, for lack of a better term, just to say no. Fuck it. I'm not going to go along with the easy route, because it's going to piss off other women, and it's going to piss off other people around you to say no and to point out injustice where you see it, when the entire system is saying the injustice is in the other direction.
Yeah, and if we can't appeal to ethics with other women. And I mean, and there's circumstances wherein a person's mentality gets to the point where you can't. There's other things. If you look at successful men and successful women, they are people who have always had to display accountability, who have always had to fend for themselves, who've always had to be responsible for their impact, their choices' impact on themselves and on other people, and who've always had to carry a load of some sort. And if you look at people whose success has brought them happiness and joy, people who have had not just possessions that they really liked, but have able to create a life for themselves and their families that they really like, that they're very happy about, that requires being able to step up and say, oh, something needs done? Okay, where do I start? I'm going to start right here. This is the first task I'll do, and then start doing the task. Start handling things. Getting other women to understand the benefit to themselves for their accountability. If you have that accountability, you want more women to be in STEM, they got to be accountable. They got to learn as little girls to be accountable. If they want to succeed in a field like that, if they want to be scientists, they have to be able to pay attention to detail. They have to be able to be accountable for the outcomes of what they're doing. If they want to work with electricity, they have to be accountable for making sure they don't kill themselves by accident. If they want to be executives, you can't be in an executive position without that degree of accountability. If you want to have those things, if you want women to have those things, teach little girls like you do little boys to fend for themselves, to support themselves, to be confident in themselves, to not act like it's the end of the world if somebody says something nasty about them, but to still be able to reevaluate themselves and come to a conclusion if they receive criticism, and instead of coddling them And
The funny thing is, I feel like that was kind of the whole goal of the whole rah, we can do it too sort of message of feminism or whatever, but it's really not at all how it's come out in practice. And
no,
if you think
it's
about it,
like they
like,
want the
Jesus,
rewards without the work.
oh God. By that definition, my dad was a better feminist than those guys because he raised me with that kind of accountability and you have to work hard to get ahead and be financially independent and all of that kind of thing. But even though he wasn't, like, that was never a thing that we talked about, but it certainly comes across more strongly in my own household than in anybody that touts the whole raw feminism flag. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I guess you could say my dad, in terms of what feminists say they want versus what they do, you could
Yeah.
say my dad's feminism, quote unquote, was he didn't have to take me to work, but he did. And I learned what he did as a photographer. I learned his trade, and I started working when I was 15. In fact, I really started doing, like, little boys have their paper route. I started working for the business doing the equivalent, except without having to deal with all the bad weather, as a 11-year-old, and I got paid for it. I got paid for it
Nice.
probably better than I would have made if I had a paper route, because my parents, they didn't want to deal with some of the I guess it's basically, you would think of it as scribing type work, and I did that, so this was the kind of thing that I learned that degree of accountability under those circumstances. And then there's a degree of accountability I have simply because if I hadn't learned to get panic under control as a very young child, my first near-death experience was at 18 months, I would not have survived. And at about 4 years old, I had it down to where the asthma attack could happen. I could be suffocating to death, and I could be calm, or at least act with a degree of calm that allowed me to do the things I needed to do to take care of the attack so that it wouldn't kill me. And this was something that my parents both pushed. My dad took me to his job. My mom took me to city council meetings. They wanted, and the same thing with my brother, they wanted us to see what you do when you're an adult. They wanted us to see what adult responsibility was. And we both learned photography. We both learned housework, all of the things that you do in housework. My brother could completely take care of himself without a wife. And if he had married somebody who didn't know any of those things, he could have been a house husband, but this was all stuff that you teach your kids, and we've lost that, and we've lost that accountability, and we've lost that situation where women are made stronger by that accountability. And I think, like we talk about women of past generations turning over in their graves, I think about Laura Ingalls Wilder, because I used to be a huge fan of the Little House on the Prairie TV series, and I read all the books, which were not the same as the TV series, and I loved the books. The TV series was good, but I loved the books, and the thing I loved about the books was it gave me strong female characters to identify with who were real people from history, who did real things that were strong and tough like the women around me did, and they weren't the wimpy figures that a lot of other books paint women to be. And so they were like the women around me, and that they would be turning over in their graves, just absolutely turning over in their graves, if they saw the way women today talk about what it's like to be a woman. We're going to move on to French Honey Badger's got 2 chats for us here. I think these are two. Yeah, these are 2 different ones.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one, French Honey Badger gave us $5 and said, women are not shamed and can get money for nothing. Why would they bother? And, of course, I think we just kind of went over one of the things that needs to be gotten across to make them decide to bother is the benefit to them. And it's not necessarily a good statement on women to say that that's what's needed. But at the other end of it, the practical application is, if that's what will work, then that's what we should do. The second one, French Honey Badger gave us another $5 and says, women are the ones choosing their husbands, and yet it's the fault of the man if she divorces him and he doesn't give her money. And that's both a social and a legal attitude. I hear all the time that every divorce is the man's fault, and he didn't do something right, and it's his job to keep the woman happy and all this stuff. And I think that's part of the reason why there are so many divorces today. Men and women both have that attitude. And I think historically, if you look back at marriage and the way it used to be before it was romantic, when it was arranged, I think both partners have always had to work very hard to make their marriage work. And we've lost that too. That's something else that we need to get back. And I think female accountability is the key to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. I see Ant-Man gave us $5 and said, Aiden Paladin, do you know the way?
Oh yes, brother. Brother, I know the way. I will show you.
An EBT gold card holder. Okay, so for everybody that doesn't know, the food stamp card and the welfare cash cards are now called EBT. I don't know what EBT stands for, but that's what EBT gold card holder is a joke, because they come in a card. They're treated like credit cards, and EBT gold card holder gives us $2. That would be the single mom with 4 kids by 4 different daddies that gets every kind of benefits you can find. Big burgeoning tentacle monster, Sargon. I suppose, did he refer to it that way first or something? Electronic benefits transfer, everybody says.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have Exploding Prinny gives us $5 and says Jughead is the OG MGTOW. And finally, Average Joe gives us I believe that's 20 pounds, and says, keep up the good work, Badgers. Keep speaking the truth, even though it will hurt some.
Damn straight.
It'll hurt in the way that when you lift weights for the first time after being athletically inactive for 20 years, it hurts. But it won't hurt in terms of, it's not a wound. Everybody in the system that doesn't have to be there could do better, and they won't do better as long as they're trapped in that system. Self-healing stem bolt. Self-healing stem bolt gave us self-sealing stem bolt. Sorry, my dyslexia is really good going tonight. Gave us €5 and said, "What do you think about the death of Albert Ingalls in the series? I know he is not in the book, but I like him." And I will be honest, as a kid, it's like when I watched that, it's been so long, I cannot remember how Albert Ingalls died in the series. And it's partly because he wasn't in the books. He was a fictional character as opposed to the main family who was not. And so I didn't identify with him as much. So you'll have to remind me how he died. And then I can tell you, because I'll probably remember the episode if a few details are given. But that being said, I may have to discuss it in the next episode, because with the delay and everything, that might not occur before it's real. We're going to be winding down here in a few minutes. Oh, and apparently Allison is in the chat.
She has snuck in.
Allison has snuck into the chat. She's lurking and watching you. Lurkity lurk lurk lurk.
I like that you've kept the size of the show to about an hour and a half.
Yeah, not like the other week. There was one week we had super chat after super chat after super chat.
I noticed last week we had like $200 last week.
You guys were crushing it.
I know.
Yeah,
I do remember that. Dale Power brought up Albert's drug addiction. That does that hits home in a I don't know if I want to go into all of why that hits home, but I will simply say this. Drug addiction is too complex of an issue to go into in depth on tonight's show. And at some point, I am going to do a bit of a discussion on the difference in accountability there as well. And like our system regarding drugs and the way society reacts to addiction is particularly dysfunctional. And you know, I can't really describe necessarily a feeling about that, except that Hollywood's version of drug addiction and Hollywood's portrayal of it isn't always very. It's not just not accurate. It's not very productive. If I remember right, and this has been like that, the adopted kids in the show they came along basically at a point when I wasn't watching as much TV at all anymore. They really were good metaphors. And if I remember right, they did a pretty good job of demonstrating a lot of the reasons that addiction isn't just a simple thing to treat, simple thing to deal with. But yeah, I really can't make a judgment on the show necessarily based on that, and I can't really make a judgment on the character based on that either. So, sorry, I actually might have to go back and look that up and rewatch it, because that's one that I don't remember getting as into as I did other episodes of the show when everybody was younger. And Average Joe wants me to define addiction. To me, my definition for addiction is if the drug, part of the damage that the drug does to your system is that it creates a not previously existing need in your system to continue taking the drug, or your bodily system will attack itself in some way or another. I know the government likes to define addiction to pain medicine in terms where if your chronic pain comes back when you're not taking the medicine, you're considered addicted. I don't buy that. And I also don't buy habit forming as an addiction if there's not a physical component to it. If your body doesn't have some sort of dysfunction in it that is specifically because you made it dependent on that drug where it wasn't before. That dysfunction didn't predate the use of that drug, then yeah, that's an addiction. I don't believe in calling something an addiction if you don't have that factor involved, because that pretty much opens up the door to labeling everything addictive, and I think that's bullshit, because it opens up the door to controlling people's behavior in ways that are not necessary and that are human rights violations. So, in any case, that's off topic, and I think we're done with the super chats. I'm going to bring Allison on, but I'm going to introduce her with something that this actually kind of goes along with what we were just talking about. And I'm going to start this with basically a personal story I've talked about before. When I got pregnant with my son, my husband and I were not married yet. And we'd already talked about it, and we were already trying to start planning. Like, we got together really fast. But at the same time, we didn't get together really fast. We were friends for years and years before we had the opportunity to get together. And, he had been married, and his wife left him, and we hung out. I had gotten dumped on the same night that he got dumped, and we commiserated. We hung out for like 6 months, pretending that we weren't dating when we really were, and then we finally, like, all right, this is stupid. We really clicked with each other. We've always been good friends. We've always worked well together, and we really got something here, and we might as well say what it is, and so on. So we'd already started talking about a future together and getting married and everything, and we decided to consummate the marriage quite a bit early, and we got pregnant. And that was really dumb, because we wanted to plan for the kids before we had another kid, before we added another kid to the mix, and we screwed that up. But in any case, we started working towards that goal anyway. We were like, all right, well, okay, now we really need to get this, and I ended up proposing, which is a whole nother story. But and I was horrible and awkward about it too. But so we're engaged at this point, and we had financial hills to get over. I had been temporarily disabled from a car accident and was getting back on my feet, and because I didn't want to be a dead weight in the marriage, and he was working, and we were living separately and trying to figure out where we're going to live, where we're going to have the wedding, when are we going to have the wedding, what are we going to do, and the Child Support Enforcement Agency decided they were going to go after him because I had been on Medicaid and stuff, and so we had to go to court and persuade a judge that it was a really stupid idea for the state to take money out of our family's budget, take $4 out of it, and then put it back into our budget 2 months later, every month. And I ended up writing, something like a 7-page letter about this. We stated our plans. We talked about, where we were in the course of our plans and everything. And it actually took a court case to get the judge to say, okay, we're not going to do child support in this situation because you're going to get, but if you don't follow through with the marriage, then we're going to go after him for back child support. So here we had the system addressing a totally different situation than we were in. The system addressed the straw man of a guy who knocked up a chick and wandered off and wasn't going to do anything, have any relationship with his child and support his child in any way. In a situation where we had a couple who basically, because we behaved stupidly, we timed our reproductive choices very poorly. The reproductive choices we would have made anyway, but we did time them very poorly. And instead of treating the problem we had, which was we got to get our shit together and get married, and leaving us alone, because that was the solution to that, letting us do what we were going to do, they were going to go after him for child support. And this is very much like, you look at the sugar issue with diabetes. Having your blood sugar too low and having your blood sugar too high have overlapping symptoms. But if you give insulin to somebody who is in a low blood sugar emergency, you will kill them. And if you give glucose to somebody who is in a high blood sugar emergency, you can send them into a coma and you can kill them. And this was a thing that, the government does this all the time. Sometimes working on the ills of society is like treating a sick patient, where dramatically different ailments can have very similar symptoms like that. But if you apply treatment for the wrong ailment, you can kill the patient. You can actually make the problem worse instead of better. And treating a crime committed with malevolence, as if it's treated by just ignorance, for instance, makes the public more vulnerable to the now severely misunderstood malevolence of its perpetrators, while potentially demonizing the innocent. And that's what our society does with sexual violence. The application of a solution to the wrong problem creates a new problem while failing to solve or even exacerbating the original problem. And that makes an important part of a men's activists' focus, a men's issues activist focus, identifying the nature of the problems we discuss in order to identify functional solutions that can be offered, and then spread awareness of that information to the general public so we as a society can seek to reform our broken system so that we can apply practical solutions instead of emotion-based solutions. And a platform like Honey Badger Radio, that provides for the creation of an open dialogue on these issues in a society where such openness is constantly under attack. It creates a means to communicate these things to others in the men's issues community without being shut down by ideologue social network administrators, and a way to explain them that can be shared for the average uninvolved person's consideration through sharing of our content online. It's like stirring the waters of a deep pool. We are able to send ripples of information into the awareness of the general public and spark discussion on a much larger scale in the hope that this will make the way for us to lead the charge in advocating more functional reforms. If we want to live in a society in which humanity is not constantly shooting itself in the foot, we have to maintain this capability. And with that, I'm going to introduce Allison.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Hannah. I wasn't expecting an introduction, but thank you. Those are some words to live by. We do need spaces where we talk about these issues and talk about every aspect of them, because we don't have the ability to talk about all the data. We create a flawed solution. Yesterday, I did a video in which I asked people who are listening to Honey Badger Radio and who believe in the message that we have and have the means. If you're not supporting us, why not? And just to send the answers to topic@badgerpod.com. I've actually had some very, very in-depth, thoughtful responses to that question, and I very much appreciate the time that was spent giving them to me. I do read each and every one of those letters, and I think about them very carefully. And I want to read one tonight. It's a short one, so we won't be here too long. Chris B. writes, I believe that your movement is a dead end. You've said it yourself, Miss Tiemann. The system that is in place in the West is rigged in all women's favor, whether or not they believe it, including you, and changing it will make it worse for them, so they oppose it. So until someone in the men's rights can prove to me how anything they propose will benefit women over men in the short term, like the current society does, it will not change a thing. It might get little concessions, but in the end, men like me will end up alone and dead sooner than we want to be. I understand the despair that's being expressed in this. I mean, not completely, because, of course, as a woman, I don't face the issues that men face, the issues of being treated as expendable and having their issues overlooked. Nor do I experience daily active harassment from the media that I'm an oppressor and that I'm shameful and that my existence is somehow a blight on the planet. So I understand this partially living it through the men that I care about. And furthermore, I understand the despair in this, because when you look at the world, it looks so flawed, if not actively hateful. And I think that it'll never be what I want it to be, which is just for men and boys, and also just for women, because I don't think this system really does serve women. Now look at how big our opposition is, how pervasive. Media publishing anti-male article after article. They're just pumping it out like there's no end to it. Academia legitimizing, blaming, and shaming men and stripping women of their sense of self in the process. And government paying feminists to go into middle schools and teach young boys that they need to take responsibility for violence against women. It's all so huge and so endless. Sometimes I just think about how worthless and petty what I do is, that I'm so small against all of that. So I can honestly say that I despair in those moments. So I know where you're coming from, Crispy, and all the other people who've said similar things to what Chris has said to me, that it's just so huge, this problem, and I feel so small. And I can't say that what gets me out of that black place is inspiring words or a flash of insight into that what I do matters. What gets me out of it is that I have shit to get done. I have data entry to do for accounting, activities that need to be coordinated, labels that need printing out, and packages that need posting and mailing, amongst many, many, many endless small tasks. And as I do these things, these concrete, simple things, bit by bit, the despair falls away. Because I know what I'm doing is building something positive, a voice, a platform that Prim and Max and Brian and Hannah can stand upon and touch the hearts of many. I'm building something that eases people's loneliness, that gives them hope and gives them a place to be. It may be nothing more than that, but it's what I can do that no one else can. And that's what I focus on. Not the size of the opposition, but what I can do to make the world better, even if it's small. And that is hope for me. And of course, if you want to help me build that platform, www.feedthebadger.com. Thank you. All right, Hannah, take us out.